Okay, we'll go on with chapter 12. But it was one thing to write a letter, and quite another to find some means of getting it under the mat. Pod, for several days, could not be persuaded to go borrowing. He was well away on his yearly turnout of the storerooms, mending partitions and putting up new shelves. Arrietty usually enjoyed the spring sorting, when half-forgotten treasures came to light and new uses were discovered for old borrowings. She used to love turning over the scraps of silk or lace, the odd kid glove, the pencil stubs, the rusty razor blades, the hairpins and the needles and dried figs, the hazelnuts, the powdery bits of chocolate, and the scarlet stubs of sealing wax. Pod one year had made her a hairbrush from a toothbrush, and Homily had made her a small pair of Turkish bloomers from 2 glove fingers for knocking about in the mornings. There were spools and spools of colored silks and cottons and small variegated balls of odd wool, pen points which Homily used as flower scoops, and bottle tops galore. But this year, Arrietty banged about impatiently and stole away whenever she dared to stare through the grating, hoping to see the boy. She now kept the letter away from her, always with her, stuffed inside her jersey, and the edges became rubbed. Once she did a run past the grating and saw his woolen stockings. He was making a chugging noise in his throat with some kind of engine, and as he turned the corner, he let out a piercing woo, woo. It was a train whistle, he told her afterwards, so he did not hear her call. One evening after dark, she crept away and tried to open the first gate, but swung and tugged as she might, she could not budge the pin. Homily, every time she swept the sitting room, would grumble about the carpet. "It may be a curtain and chair job," she would say to Pod, "but it wouldn't take you not a quarter of an hour with your pen and name tape to fetch me a bit of blotting paper from the desk in the morning room. Anyone would think, looking at this floor, that we lived in a toad hole." "No one could call me house-proud," said Homily. "You couldn't be, not with my kind of family, but I do like to keep things nice." And at last, on the 4th day, Pod gave in. He laid down the hammer, a small electric bell hammer, and said to Arrietty, "Come along." Arrietty was glad to see the morning room. The door, luckily, had been left ajar, and it was fascinating to stand at last in the thick pile of the carpet, gazing upward at the shelves and pillars and towering gables of the famous overmantel. So it's overmantel is like the mantle on your fireplace. So that's where they had lived, she thought. Those pleasure-loving creatures, remote and gay and self-sufficient. She imagined the overmantel women, a little Tweety, Homily had described them, with wasp waists and piled Edwardian hair, swinging carelessly outward on the pilasters, lissom and laughing, gazing at themselves in the inset looking glass, which reflected back the tobacco jars, the cut glass decanters, the bookshelves, and the plush-covered table. She imagined the overmantel men. Fair, they were said to be, with long mustaches and nervous, slender hands, smoking and drinking and telling their witty tales. So they had never asked Homily up there. Poor Homily, with her bony nose and never tidy hair. They would have looked at her strangely, Arrietty thought, with long, half-laughing eyes, and smiled a little and, humming, turned away. And they had lived only on breakfast food, on toast and egg and tiny snips of mushroom, sausage. They hadn't had any. A sausage they'd have had, and crispy bacon with little sips of tea and coffee. Where were they now, Arrietty wondered. Where could such creatures go? These were the family that lived on the mantelpiece that were called the overmantels. Pod had flung his pen, so it stuck to the seat of the chair and was up the leg in a thrice. Leaning outward on his tape then, pulling out the pin, he slung it like a javelin above his head into a fold of the curtain. This is the moment, Arrietty thought, and felt for her precious letter. She slipped into the hall. It was darker this time, with the front door closed, and she ran across it with a beating heart. The mat was heavy, but she lifted up the corner and slid the letter under by pushing with her foot. "There," she said, and looked about her. Shadows, shadows, and the ticking clock. She looked across the great plain of floor to where in the distance the stairs mounted. Another world above, she thought. World on world. She shivered slightly. Arrietty called Pod softly from the morning room, and she ran back in time to see him swing clear of the chair seat and pull himself upward on the name tape, level with the desk. Lightly he came down, feet apart, and she saw him for safety's sake twist the name tape lightly around his wrist. "I wanted you to see that," he said, a little breathless. The blotting paper, when he pushed it, floated down quite softly, riding lightly on the air, and lay at last some feet beyond the desk, pink and fresh on the carpet's dingy pile. "You start rolling," whispered Pod. "I'll be down." And Arrietty went on her knees and began to roll the blotting paper until it grew too stiff for her to hold. Pod soon finished it off and lashed it. Here she is with the paper, trying to fold the paper. With his name tape, through which he ran his hat pin. So he's rolling it up and putting the name tape, I don't know what that is, and put his hat pin through it. Together they carried the long cylinder as two house painters would carry a ladder, under the clock, down the hole. Homily heartily thanked them when, panting a little, they dropped the bundle in the passage outside the sitting room door. She looked alarmed. "Oh, there you are," she said. "Thank goodness. That boy's about again. I've just heard Mrs. Driver talking to Camphor." "Oh," cried Arrietty, "what did she say?" And Homily glanced sharply at her and saw that she looked pale. Arrietty realized she should have said, "What boy?" It was too late now. "Nothing real bad," Homily went on, as though to reassure her. "It's just a boy they have upstairs. It's nothing at all. But I heard Mrs. Driver say that she'd take a slipper to him. See if she wouldn't, if he had the mats up once again in the hall." "The mats up in the hall?" echoed Arrietty. "Yes, 3 days running," she said to Camphor. "He'd had the mats up in the hall. She could tell," she said, "by the dust and the way he'd put them back. It was the hall part that worried me, seeing as you and your father—" "What's the matter, Arrietty? There's no call for that sort of face. Come on now. Help me move the furniture, and we'll get down the carpet." Oh dear, thought Arrietty miserably as she helped her mother empty the matchbox chest of drawers. 3 days running. He's looked, and nothing there. He'll give up hope. Now he'll never look again. So the boy had been looking every day for her note, and Camphor, the maid, had noticed that something was wrong with the mat. That evening she stood for hours on a stool under the chute in their kitchen, pretending she was practicing to get a feeling, when really she was listening to Mrs. Driver's conversation with Camphor. All she learned was that Mrs. Driver's feet were killing her, and that it was a pity that she hadn't given in her notice last May. And would Camphor have another drop, considering there was more in the cellar than anyone could drink in a lifetime? And if they thought she was going to clean the first floor windows single-handed, they had better think again. But on the third night, just as Arrietty had climbed down off the stool before she overbalanced with weariness, she heard Camphor say, "If you ask me, I'd say he had a ferret." And quickly, Arrietty climbed back again, holding her breath. "A ferret," she heard Mrs. Driver claim shrilly. "Whatever next? Where would he keep it?" "That I wouldn't like to say," said Camphor in his rumbling, earthy voice. "All I know is he was up beyond Parkin's Beck, going all around the banks and calling down all the rabbit holes." "Well, I never," said Mrs. Driver. "Where's your glass?" "Just a drop," said Camphor. "That's enough. Goes to your liver, the sweet stuff. Not like beer, it isn't. Yes," he went on, "when he saw me coming with a gun, he pretended to be cutting a stick, like from the hedge." but I'd seen him all right and heard him calling away, his nose down a rabbit hole. It's my belief he's got a ferret. There was a gulp as though Camp Furl was drinking. Yes, he said. Here's Camp Furl and Mrs. Driver. And they're having a drink, a little sip of whiskey or something, because there's plenty in the basement. And he saw the boy talking down the rabbit holes, and obviously he's looking for Mr. Hendreary to deliver the note that Arrietty wrote. At last, and Arrietty heard him set down the glass. A ferret called Uncle something. So we heard him say Uncle Hendreary. Arrietty made a sharp movement, balanced for one moment with arms waving, and fell off the stool. There was a clatter as the stool slid sideways, banged against the chest of drawers, and rolled over. What was that? Asked Camp Furl. There was a silence upstairs, and Arrietty held her breath. I didn't hear nothing, said Mrs. Driver. Yes, said Camp Furl, it was under the floor, like there by the stove. That's nothing, said Mrs. Driver. It's the coals falling. Often sounds like that, scares you sometimes when you're just sitting here alone. Here, pass your glass. There's only a drop left. Might as well finish the bottle. They're drinking fine old Madeira. It's Madeira, not Madeira, thought Arrietty, and very carefully she set the stool upright and stood quietly beside it, looking up. She could see light through the crack, occasionally flicked with shadow as one person or another moved a hand or an arm. Yes, went on Camp Furl, returning to his story, and when I come up with my gun, he says, all innocent-like, to put me off. I shouldn't wonder. Any old badgers sets round here? Artful, said Mrs. Driver. The things they think of, badger sets. And she gave her creaking laugh. As a matter of fact, said Camp Furl, there used to be one. But when I showed him where it was, he didn't take no notice. I didn't see Arrietty under the step there, under the floor. She's trying to listen. Through a hole in the floor. He didn't take no notice of it. He just stood there, waiting for me to go. Camp Furl laughed. Two can play at that game, I thought. So I just sit myself down, and there we were, the two of us. And what happened? Well, he had to go off in the end, leaving his ferret. I waited a bit, but it never came out. I poked around a bit and whistled. Pity I never heard properly what he called it. Uncle something. It sounded like... Arrietty heard the sudden scrape of a chair. Well, said Camp Furl, I'd better get off now and shut up the chickens. The scullery door banged, and there was a sudden clatter overhead as Mrs. Driver began to rake the stove. Arrietty replaced the stool and stole softly into the sitting room, where she found her mother alone. Wonder if her mother heard all that. That's the end of chapter 12.